Hello, today I'm going to talk about the varieties of scholasticism, the second of two videos on chapter 6 of B.B. Price's book on medieval thought. The book itself came out in 1992, and I've already covered the first two and the last two sections, which were relatively short, and now we'll just talk about the varieties of scholasticism. So the varieties of scholasticism cover three different areas to do with ontology, epistemological positions, and theological positions. It's hard, of course, to simplify medieval philosophy, and this is going to be a very, very brief summary. I'll put a couple of links to useful books to read in the notes below. The oldest issues in Christian philosophy and theology were ontological, that is, what is the nature of being. Classical debates had focused on the distinction between the use of the verb to be and the actual existence of the objects described. But for medievals, the debate focused on such terms as essence and existence, reification and de-reification, potentiality and actuality, and the individual, plural, and universal. For Christian theologians, the question of existence had always been central. What was the nature of God's existence? How is God revealed to humankind? What is the nature of human beings, both in the material world and the life hereafter? What was the nature of creation and of Jesus Christ's birth and resurrection? Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century had been one of the first to develop a comprehensive Christian view of existence, and he was heavily influenced by Plotinus and Neoplatonism. There was fresh interest in the 11th century, both in scriptural exegesis and topical works by Anselm and Abelard. Medievals asked philosophically if God existed, the answer being obvious to them. They were interested in language and the connection between reason and faith. Anselm, for example, wanted to prove logically that God existed, an idea also developed in various ways by Aquinas and later Duns Scotus and Francis Suarez. In the early scholastic period, ideas derived from Platonism were still dominant in the form of philosophical realism. But from the mid-14th century, nominalist ideas predominated. For the extreme realist, any universal idea, for example, a book, exists prior to and independent of any particular book. It was expressed in each individual book. For the extreme nominalist, by contrast, only the individual thing had existence. There were no universals, so that terms such as book merely denoted the similarity of like things, with we ourselves assigning the categories. Realists would then ask that if the universal exists outside the mind, how do individual things come to exist? What is the principle of individuation of numerically individual things? Nominalists, for their part, would ask if universals don't exist outside the mind, how were the collectivizing concepts so common in speech inspired? How were they related to actual existing things? Scholasticism accommodated both extremes, treating them as opposite ends of a spectrum, as well as of moderate forms of each. Abelard's moderate view was the most influential. Universals only existed as word concepts in human understanding, but they did actually signify real things, that is, the particulars that were present. The discussion of universals intensified from the late 13th century onwards, with contributions from both people like Duns Scotus, a moderate realist, and William Orkin, a nominalist. Another hotly contested debate was on the ontological distinction between essence, that which is, and existence, that by which a thing is, a formulation stemming from the late 12th and 13th century discussions of Aristotle and his Arabic commentators, especially Ibn Sina. Essence refers to the things that exist, existence to the act or state of the essence. Ibn Sina, as I say, was a major source for this discussion, but it was taken up by Thomas Aquinas and others in the West. Then there was the question of change, which covered all forms of natural change: land formations, weather, planetary positions, minerals, plants and animals, including humans. The underlying question being, what is change and what causes it? Philosophical distinctions were developed between the actuality and potentiality of change, as well as mathematical descriptions of motion as a form of change, and of concepts such as average speed and acceleration. Adapting Aristotle, scholastics distinguished between the proximate cause of change and its ultimate cause. Light, together with celestial motion and other influences, were seen as causal mechanisms. There were also theories that metals were formed by the generation of worms from dark mud. Celestial astrology and celestial Neoplatonic intelligences, an idea taken from Arabic sources. In relationship to epistemology, Aristotle had provoked a variety of questions. Is knowledge rooted in sense perception or a divinely given capacity to understand? Can human beings understand everything, including God? What is the proper way to proceed to learn how to reason? Is accessible knowledge ordered, and if so, how? In the 13th century, there was confidence that almost everything was accessible to human cognition and classification. Regarding human cognition, questions here included what were the possible and proper objects of knowledge, and this was tied to the ontological question of universals. Do we learn only about one thing or about what is common to several things? And another question, what was the nature of the human intellect and imaginations as the means by which we apprehend the nature of reality? Much of the resultant discussion was what we would now think of as psychology. How reliable were the senses? Those influenced by Augustine thought of the senses as deceptive. The only certain knowledge came through divine illumination. Others thought that the processes of sense perception were good, but the limitations of human judgment might cause humans to make mistakes. Then we have the hierarchy of knowledge. Not all objects were equally accessible to cognition. For Aristotle, the cognitive process was based on abstraction, so individualized matter was the most accessible. Mathematical and finally metaphysical knowledge were at progressively higher levels of abstraction, an affirmation which for medievals underlined the exalted position of theology. Then we have theological aspects of philosophy. Although these debates may seem obscure to us, they were rooted in earlier discussions from Plato, the Neoplatonists, Aristotle and his Muslim commentators such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. There were a few thinkers, for example John of Salisbury in the mid-12th century, who were completely exasperated by what they saw as a waste of time and effort. The question had been endlessly debated without result, but they were in the minority. For most scholastic, these questions of existence, identity and knowability were important because they were fundamentally theological, not just as exercises in philosophy and psychology. At the same time, they were willing to isolate the philosophical questions from theology, particularly as the debates were well established outside of a theological context by both the ancient Greeks and by the non-Christian Muslims. Nevertheless, they gave theological slants to philosophy. Thus, regarding universals, extreme nominalism was rejected by Orthodox Christians, as it seemed to imply that the three parts of the Trinity had no shared divine nature and were separate entities. Extreme realism, however, was also rejected. God wouldn't create a universal human being without creating specific individual humans. Regarding essence and existence, For the theologians, creator and created were clearly separate. God's existence was necessary, not accidental, and he only had one mode of being. Created things received their existence from God according to their particular essence. The word debates about the soul, however. Was it the substantial form of man or the agent of intellection? Regarding change, two ideas are mentioned here. One is hylomorphism, the idea that all beings, excluding God, are composed of matter and form, thus souls would be corruptible like matter. And secondly, transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine used in the Eucharistic Mass actually changed into the body and blood of Christ, a theological doctrine adopted at the Fourth Lateran Church Council in 1215. To some thinkers, this didn't seem compatible with Aristotelianism, but the official church response was that God had the power to make an attribute that didn't have a substance. Regarding human cognition, the relationship human beings had with God was through perception, reason, or revelation. The extent to which theological knowledge depended upon revelation was heavily debated, however. The Franciscan, Bonaventure, avowed that all knowledge was dependent on divine illumination, especially concerning knowledge of the divine, whereas the Dominican, Thomas Aquinas, thought that knowledge was fully accessible through reason and faith. These two schools became known as the Franciscan and Dominican schools. Both were influential, and both were acceptable to church authorities. However, those mystics who completely rejected reason, and those Latin followers of Ibn Rushd who held only to reason, were criticized. The episcopal condemnations of 1270 and 1277 rejected both the Platonic teachings of the unity of the intellect and the Aristotelian one that man understands all. Almost all scholastics, however, thought that there was no limit on human cognition and knowledge, and that as Christians they were able to understand more than the earlier pagans. Finally, the hierarchy of knowledge. For the theologians, theology was the highest form of knowledge, though scholars differed in the extent to which other sciences should be judged by it. Many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Farzel, David Langnes, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Wetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Yazdani. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please like, comment, and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about the dictates of philosophy. Have a good day.